With over 20 years as a hairstylist, I've noticed that many people see flakes and they immediately run to dandruff. Or they think that they need grease, things like that, in order to be able to battle with the flakes that are in their head. And in some instances, sure, that could potentially help, but in other instances, it can make things so much worse. So I want to go ahead and break down with you, starting with the most common and probably the easiest one to fix, which is dry scalp. Now let me first start this video by saying that I am not a medical professional, nor am I your medical professional. Utilize the information in this video to know when it should be time for you to go see a medical professional. Do not consider this a diagnosis. It's just information for you to be able to have so you can be armed and know when you need help. I'm going to be using some food items as examples today so that way you kind of know for reference. So let's say you're noticing flakes in your head that are small and they're like the size of iodized salt. I mean, it doesn't have to be iodized salt, but regular table salt. Okay, so naturally salt is finely ground and you're not really going to see a ton of it, things like that. So I'm just going to take a bit of that and place that on the surface here. You notice how small these are. Now I want to go ahead and draw your attention to that because a lot of times if you're noticing you have smaller flakes like this, it tends to be dry scalp rather than being dandruff or being seborrheic dermatitis, things like that. Now to give reference to what that looks like in person, I'm going to go ahead and show you my scalp because it's actually dry right now, and I want to show you just how deceiving it can be. So let me lean forward here and I'm going to zoom you in. Here is my scalp. If you notice, you don't really see a ton of flakes with it like this. So you may have dry scalp and may not notice that you have flakes present in the hair, things like that. But if you'll notice, a lot of times those flakes will show up as you are rubbing, scratching, things like that. So you may not notice it now. Let me see here if I can, I want to make sure you're zoomed in. You may not notice it now, but when I begin to rub, all of a sudden you'll see those flakes show up, and notice they look very similar to how that salt did. One of the easiest ways to battle with dry scalp is to, number one, ensure that you're not using excessively hot water while you shampoo and condition that hair. Number two, to ensure that you're using a more mild cleanser rather than utilizing a cleanser that is very stripping. So you want to stay away from harsh sulfates. You don't want to use things like clarifying shampoo on a regular basis. And you definitely want to stay away from these trends that you see online where people are using like Dawn dish soap and things like that. It's removing a lot of that hydration from the skin as well as from the hair. So while it may be getting that hair stripped clean, it's also stripping all of your hydration, things to focus on. Same thing goes for when you're utilizing some of the cheaper shampoos that are very heavy on fragrance, things like that. And you can also see some slight irritation to the scalp if you have a sensitive scalp and you're noticing there are fragrances and things like that in your products. You can notice some flaking, some residual dryness, things like that from that as well. So we've talked about dry scalp. Let's go ahead and talk about dandruff. Now, dandruff tends to be a bit different, and contrary to popular belief, dandruff is actually a fungal infection of the scalp caused by Melissezia. Basically, whenever I'm looking at dandruff, dandruff can be constantly present in the hair, whether you just shampooed or not. It doesn't seem like it just sits on the scalp. A lot of times it tends to be in throughout the hair. So I just want to make sure you know how to identify it first, and then we'll talk about how to deal with it. For that, I'm going to use grits. Okay, so we've got our salt here, and then from there I'm going to go ahead and open these grits. Don't judge the fact that they're quick grits. You know, when you got little people, you got to do what you got to do. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and take some of those out. And I want you to just see how that tends to be a little bit more coarse. I don't know if you can tell the difference. Let me zoom in a little more. So you see the size of the flakes? They're a little bit more coarse, things like that. So I don't want you to pay attention so much to the coloration, but do pay attention to the size of the flakes, things like that. So on the footage, you can kind of see like these can vary in size, but you tend to have some larger flakes in there. It's not just all like that finely ground looking situation there, okay? So again, dry scalp, which looks a lot like salt, very finely ground. Your things like dandruff have a tendency to look like grits, as you can see here. So hopefully now you can see the difference between like the differences in sizes and textures, as well as what it's like when you just have dry scalp. Lord, I just got grits all over my camera. It's everywhere. Okay, so now let's say this is you and you have dandruff. You could have two different kinds. You could have dry dandruff or oily dandruff. Oily dandruff tends to be a bit more waxy. It tends to stick to the scalp. It tends to be a bit more yellowish in color. Dry dandruff tends to be a bit more white, tends to fall off of the scalp a bit more and be in throughout the hair. And there can be differing levels of intensity. A lot of times that boils down to how much oil your scalp is producing. So if you have active oil glands, you have typically more oily dandruff. Also, if you're noticing that you have an itchy scalp, like you shampoo, things like that, and you're itching quite a bit and you're constantly getting matter up underneath the fingernails, or especially if that matter feels waxy, things like that, that's typically another form of dandruff. So if you're noticing that, what can you do? Now, I know a lot of times people will talk about certain things like apple cider vinegar rinsing the scalp, things like that. And while sure, technically that can help to some degree, that's really for extremely mild cases. It's also possible for you to have the dandruff and the dry scalp combined. So when you're looking at those different factors, you may see where you've constantly got some issues on the scalp, and you may see itching from the dry scalp as well. Just like if your skin is dry anywhere else, it's going to itch. But if you're getting the itching and you're not getting anything under the nails, you're seeing the small flakes that are popping up only after scratching, that's dry scalp. If you're seeing the flakes that are there pretty regularly, or you're scratching and you're getting matter up underneath the fingernails, likely you're dealing with some form of dandruff. In that instance, you can sure use something like the apple cider vinegar situation if you want to go the natural route. But if that is not working for you, especially if you have the combination of dandruff and dry scalp, you could use something like the Royal Oils line from Head & Shoulders. The nice thing with this one here is it helps out with keeping some level of hydration in the hair and the scalp while still taking care of that with the active ingredient in here, which is pyrethylene zinc. If you're needing something a little bit more intense, especially if you have really oily dandruff, things along that line, you can go more so with Nizoral. And if you're noticing that neither one, I don't have Nizoral here at the house, I apologize. I'll try to find a little picture. If you're noticing neither one of those is working, you probably want to go ahead and chat with your doctor and see about getting a prescription medication where either it has a tar-based product in there, or it's got a stronger formulation of the pyrethylene zinc and things like that in there in order to be able to help out with the dandruff. Those tend to be mild cases of flakes, but you can still have something a bit more severe. Now, typically with dandruff, you can put oil on there all day long. The oil is not going to help. It's not necessarily going to make it worse, but it can make it a bit more sticky to the scalp, which if you're having issues with dandruff, I don't know that you would necessarily want it sticky to the scalp. So dry scalp and an application of oil, sure, could potentially help. Dandruff, application of oil, now you just have oily dandruff. So now we're going to get into our third size, and this one is the final one I'm going to talk about, but it can have multiple different aspects of it. So I want to make sure I deal with you pretty thoroughly. And in this category specifically, you want to look into seeking medical attention, things like that. So hairstylists can't really help you out with this, okay? If you have something like seborrheic dermatitis, eczema, or psoriasis, you may notice more of a flake size like oatmeal. So let's go ahead and bring you back down to the table. All right, again, so we have the salt, which is representative of the dry scalp. We have the grits, which is more representative of dandruff. And now we have our oats. The oats are more representative of your, this just feels too bright. Hold on, let me see what I can do with this here. Can y'all see that better? I hope so. So we've got our salt, which is more representative of dry scalp, our grits, which is more representative of dandruff. And then from there we have our oats. Now the oats are going to be more representative of things like seborrheic dermatitis. This is going to be more representative of things like eczema or psoriasis. But the way that each of those conditions reacts to certain products you put on there could be entirely different. And honestly, if you're anywhere in this category, you likely need medical attention. But let's talk about other signs that you can look for to know kind of where you could potentially fall and what you should talk to your doctor about. Okay, so each of the instances in the oats category, you'll want to go ahead and make sure you're seeking medical attention for. However, if you're noticing that you didn't have the flakes there, or you're having to scratch them up off of the scalp and their oat size, and then from there, let's say you put oil on your scalp, something like that, and those flakes are right back in a number of days, you're likely falling in the category of seborrheic dermatitis. If you should have seborrheic dermatitis, or if you've been diagnosed with seborrheic dermatitis, I can tell you now, it is a chronic condition with an inflammation of the oil glands. They're overactive. In this instance, applying any oil, greases, butters, things like that to the scalp will only make it worse. It's going to cause it to flare up. So if you're noticing that you're putting braids in your hair and they're slathering your scalp with braiding gel and things like that, if you wonder why I tell people those products aren't for your scalp, that's a huge part of the reason for why. If you're noticing that certain oils help out with soothing and calming and minimizing those flakes, you may be more so in the side of eczema and psoriasis. So let's go ahead and talk about that some. With eczema, it tends to be scaly. It doesn't easily peel up, and it's a bit more itchy. It can be sore in there, but it really doesn't peel up off the scalp like seborrheic dermatitis does. So if you have eczema somewhere else, yes, it's possible for you to end up with it on the scalp as well. Either way, you need to seek medical attention. Oils can potentially help with that, and honestly, a lot of times the medications that they'll give you for the topical medications that they'll give you for your eczema and things like that tend to be oil based. So a lot of times oils can actually help in that instance, but if it's a type of eczema that's induced by allergies, things like that, you really want to be careful about the types of oils you're putting on there, ensuring that you're not putting an oil on there that you may have sensitivities to. So I would say definitely be careful about that, and be mindful if you have issues with oils like coconut oil, things like that. You want to be mindful about putting things like that on the scalp. So again, this is why you would want to see your doctor, and that way you can go ahead and find out, because eczema is a tricky one sometimes, especially if you've got more of a dry eczema or more of an eczema that's flare up from overly moist areas, things like that. So talk to your doctor. If you have psoriasis, a lot of times you may have flakes that can be pretty easily peeled up, but you'll notice underneath those flakes, that skin can look very pink, very shiny, really irritated. You can still have soreness. If you're putting chemicals and things in the hair, you'll notice that that scalp tends to burn pretty frequently with the application of those chemicals. Usually you want to try to avoid putting chemicals on the scalp. In that instance, the scalp is open, it's raw. Okay, putting a chemical and things like that on the scalp is not only causing burning, it's causing those things to enter into the bloodstream. It's going to increase issues with your scalp irritation, things like that. And I have literally seen people, especially when wearing relaxers, things like that, where they're constantly getting burning in those areas, even if they're basing the scalp with a protective base cream. And it ends up leading to hair loss because the scar tissue that develops over time, the hair cannot physically grow through. So just be mindful of that in there. If you have seborrheic dermatitis and you also have dry scalp, you're probably wondering, what can I do? Because you just told me not to put oils on there. Or you have dry scalp and you're not really comfortable with oils, your scalp produces quite a bit of oils, things like that. I don't typically recommend putting oils on the hair in general. What I do for myself and for my clients, my kids, all of that, if we're having issues with dry scalp, or if I notice something like seborrheic dermatitis where we need to increase hydration, but we don't want to increase oil, what I'll do is I'll apply a bit of Thayer's brand witch hazel, the astringent. The reason why I'll utilize this is because while it does have some alcohol in there, which helps out with removing some of the excess oil, it also has your vegetable glycerin in here. It also has aloe vera leaf juice. So it has multiple humectants in there. Its job it is to pull moisture out of the air and into the surface of hair or skin that you put it on. So while yes, we have an alcohol in there, we also have humectants in there to bring hydration back. So that's why I often will recommend that. And I honestly learned this from the Sister Lock community. So instead of applying it directly like this, I'll typically put it in a spray bottle, go ahead and separate out. So like if I just did braids, locks, things like that, I'll go ahead and apply, rub in the area. If you are in, like, let's say cornrows, something like that, you can apply this to the scalp and then go through with a Q-tip and be able to lightly remove excess oil that way. You'll find it to be rather refreshing, but a lot of times I don't wait for the scalp to start acting up. If you just got cornrows from me, I don't apply any products to the scalp, and I'll go ahead and apply this directly to the scalp once everything is finished. It feels cool, it feels refreshing, and it helps out with preventing issues with dryness, flare-ups, things along that line from the instances that I've noticed. Now, again, I will say none of this is constituted as medical advice, nor am I a medical professional, but these are things that I've noticed over 20 years of experience in the industry, behind the chair, doing people's hair with all forms of scalp conditions. And I wanted to make sure to share this with you, because if you have something like seborrheic dermatitis and you're treating it like dry scalp, you can make it worse. If you have something like dandruff and you're treating it like dry scalp, now you just have oily dandruff that didn't even fall out. It's just everywhere. And if you have dandruff and you're applying oil on there, especially if it's already an oily dandruff, congratulations, now that scalp is just an oily mess. So my hope is that you've gotten some information in this video to be able to help you identify which is which in there. If so, let me know in the comments down below. I apologize, I know this video is pretty boring, but hopefully it's been packed full of information to help you out. Until next time, take care, God bless, stay glam, you know I love you, boo, and don't forget to subscribe. Bye.